Marcus Chen sat in the back row of the Galactic Military Academy's Advanced Weapons Theory classroom, his fingers obsessively tapping against the smooth metal surface of his desk. The lecture hall buzzed with the chittering, clicking, and harmonic tones of a dozen different alien species, all supposedly the best military minds their worlds had to offer. At 19, Marcus was the youngest cadet in the program, and definitely the only human. The Zenthari instructor, Professor Vexthal, stood at the front of the room with forearms gesticulating wildly as she explained the finer points of plasma rifle calibration. Her crystalline exoskeleton caught the artificial light, creating prismatic patterns across the walls. Marcus had learned to read her body language over the past 6 months. The slight tilt of her triangular head meant she was about to ask someone a difficult question. The key to effective ranged combat, Vexthal said, her voice carrying the musical quality common to her species, lies in understanding energy transfer coefficients and target penetration matrices. Modern warfare has evolved far beyond the primitive projectile weapons of our ancestors. A low rumble of agreement came from Korath, the massive Drachmarian sitting 3 seats to Marcus's left. The reptilian alien species had dominated galactic military doctrine for the past 2 centuries, their natural armor and strength making them ideal shock troopers. Korath's yellow eyes gleamed with satisfaction. His people had invented the plasma lance that was now standard issue across most civilized worlds. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though internally he bristled at the casual dismissal of primitive weapons. He'd grown up on Earth's frontier colonies, where energy weapons were expensive and unreliable in harsh environments. His father had taught him to hunt with chemical propellant firearms and even more basic tools when necessary. There was nothing primitive about a well-placed shot or understanding trajectory, wind resistance, and target movement. Now then, Vexthal continued, her forearms coming to rest at her sides in what Marcus had learned was her species' version of crossing arms. Your final examination will be somewhat different from traditional testing methods. The classroom fell silent except for the quiet humming of the ventilation system. Even Zara, the perpetually chattering Nexian whose species communicated primarily through rapid-fire clicking sounds, stopped her constant background noise. Vexthal's mandibles curved upward in what might have been a smile. Instead of a written examination, you will demonstrate your understanding of weapons theory through practical application. Each of you will be given access to this classroom's materials and 30 minutes to construct a functional ranged weapon. You may use anything in this room, but you cannot leave to gather additional materials. Marcus felt a flutter of excitement in his chest. This was exactly the kind of challenge he'd hoped for when he'd applied to the academy. While the other cadets relied heavily on technology and established doctrine, his upbringing had taught him to be creative and resourceful. Thrix, a tall, pale Alvari with elongated limbs and large, dark eyes, raised one of her 4-fingered hands. Professor, are we to assume that energy sources will be available? My species' traditional plasma weaving techniques require you may use only what is present in this classroom, Vexthal interrupted. No external power sources, no weapons components from other rooms, nothing but your knowledge and creativity. The excitement in the room died noticeably. Marcus glanced around at his classmates' faces and saw confusion and concern written in a dozen different alien expressions. Most of these cadets came from technologically advanced worlds where weapons were sophisticated pieces of engineering requiring specialized components and energy sources. Korath's deep voice rumbled through the silence. Professor, surely you cannot expect us to craft effective weapons without proper materials? The Drachmarian military has developed our plasma lances over centuries of refinement. The greatest military minds throughout history have often faced situations where ideal equipment was not available, Vexthal replied. Adaptability and creative thinking are far more valuable than reliance on specific technologies. Consider this: what if you found yourself stranded on a primitive world? What if your ship's armory was damaged? What if you faced an enemy who had adapted countermeasures to all known weapon types? Marcus nodded unconsciously. His father had always said that a good soldier could make a weapon out of anything, but a great soldier could make a weapon out of nothing. Vexthal began walking between the rows of desks, her crystalline feet clicking against the metal floor. Your weapons will be tested for accuracy, range, and stopping power against standard Academy target drones. You will be judged not only on effectiveness but also on innovation and efficient use of available materials. As she spoke, Marcus was already cataloging the room's contents. The desks were made of a light but durable polymer, the chairs had metal frames with adjustable mechanisms, and the walls were lined with display screens for educational materials. The classroom's learning aids included physical models of various weapon components, measurement tools, and even some basic raw materials for demonstration purposes. More importantly, Marcus noticed things his classmates probably hadn't even considered. The long, straight fluorescent light fixtures could be removed from their housings. The elastic cords used to secure some of the wall-mounted displays could be repurposed. The classroom's acoustic dampening materials had a fibrous structure that might be useful. "Wait," said Pix, a small but fierce Kytherian with chitinous armor plates covering her compact frame. "Are you saying we're supposed to build weapons like savages? Without proper power cores or plasma conduits?" Several other cadets murmured agreement with Pix's concerns. Marcus bit back a smile. They were thinking about the problem all wrong, approaching it from the perspective of their technological backgrounds instead of considering fundamental principles. Vexdal's head tilted slightly, and Marcus caught the subtle body language cue that meant she was pleased with how the discussion was developing. "I am saying that true military leaders must be prepared for any situation. Now, you have 28 minutes remaining. I suggest you begin." Chaos erupted as the cadets scrambled to examine the classroom materials. Korath immediately gravitated toward the electronic displays, trying to figure out how to weaponize the power systems. Thrix began collecting small metal objects, apparently planning to create some sort of electromagnetic accelerator. Zara clicked rapidly to herself as she examined the chemical cleaning supplies stored in a cabinet near the back wall. Marcus remained seated, closing his eyes and thinking through the problem systematically. What did he need to create an effective ranged weapon? The basic principles were simple: store energy, transfer that energy to a projectile, and ensure accuracy in delivery. The easiest energy storage system available was elastic potential energy. The classroom had several sources of elastic materials: the bungee cords securing wall displays, the flexible mounting arms of adjustable desk lamps, and even the spring mechanisms in the chair height adjustments. For projectiles, he needed something with good aerodynamic properties and sufficient mass to carry energy to the target. The classroom had various small objects that could work, but, better yet, he could craft custom projectiles if he had the right materials. Marcus opened his eyes and began moving with purpose. First, he carefully removed two of the fluorescent light tubes from their ceiling fixtures. The tubes were long, straight, and surprisingly flexible while being strong enough to store significant elastic energy. He tested the flex of one tube carefully, feeling how much bend it could take before approaching its failure point. Next, he gathered paracord from the equipment storage area, the same type of strong, lightweight rope his father had taught him to always carry. The academy had it available for various training exercises involving knot work and climbing techniques. As he worked, Marcus was aware of his classmates' growing frustration. Korath had successfully removed a power cell from one of the display screens but couldn't figure out how to create a useful energy projection system without proper focusing elements. Thrix had constructed an elaborate framework of metal rods but lacked any means of accelerating projectiles through it. Marcus laid the two fluorescent tubes parallel to each other, about an arm's width apart, and began the careful process of connecting them with paracord. The design forming in his mind was based on a traditional earth longbow, but adapted for available materials and optimized for the specific requirements of the test. The key was in the engineering details. By using two tubes instead of one, he could distribute stress more evenly and increase the energy storage capacity. The paracord would serve as the bowstring, but also as the structural element holding the entire assembly together. "What is the human doing?" Pix's voice carried clearly across the room, filled with curiosity and just a hint of disdain. Marcus didn't look up from his work. He was carefully wrapping paracord around the ends of the fluorescent tubes, creating the attachment points for his bowstring. The wrapping had to be tight enough to prevent slippage but positioned precisely to ensure proper alignment. "It appears to be some sort of mechanical device?" Zara's clicking had taken on a questioning rhythm. "I cannot identify the energy source." That was the beautiful part, Marcus thought as he strung his bow for the first time. The energy source was human muscle power, converted to elastic potential energy in the flex tubes, then transferred to kinetic energy in the projectile. Simple, reliable, and completely independent of external power sources. He drew the string back experimentally, feeling the resistance build as the fluorescent tubes bent. The balance felt good, and the draw weight was substantial but manageable. Now he needed projectiles. Marcus gathered several metal rods from the demonstration equipment, pieces originally used to show magnetic field interactions. Each rod was about the length of his forearm, straight, and reasonably well balanced. He used his multi-tool to sharpen one end of each rod slightly, not enough to make them deadly against the training drones, but enough to improve penetration and accuracy. 15 minutes remaining, Vexthal announced. Around the room, the other cadets were making progress of various kinds. Korath had managed to create a device that could throw small objects using electromagnetic forces, though it seemed to require manual charging between shots. Thrix had constructed something resembling a crossbow, but using torsion springs instead of traditional flexion. Zara had created what appeared to be a small chemical rocket launcher, though Marcus had doubts about its accuracy at range. Marcus spent his remaining time fine-tuning his bow and crafting additional projectiles. He adjusted the string tension, tested the balance point, and practiced his draw technique. The weapon felt natural in his hands, like an extension of his body rather than an unfamiliar tool. More importantly, he was confident in the underlying physics. The bow could store and release significant energy, the projectiles were well designed for their purpose, and his years of experience with similar weapons gave him a major advantage in accuracy and technique. With 5 minutes remaining, Marcus allowed himself to observe his classmates' final preparations. Most had created devices that were impressive from an engineering standpoint but seemed impractical for actual combat use. Complex mechanisms requiring careful setup, weapons that could only fire once before needing extensive reloading procedures, or designs that sacrificed accuracy for power. Vexthal began walking around the room, examining each cadet's creation with interest but no visible judgment. When she reached Marcus's station, she paused longer than usual, her crystalline head tilting as she examined the bow from multiple angles. "Interesting," she said, her musical voice carrying a note Marcus couldn't quite interpret. "This appears to be based on pre-industrial projectile weapon designs." "Yes, Professor," Marcus replied. "It's adapted from what my species calls a compound bow, though modified for available materials and mission requirements." "And you believe this will be effective against Academy standard target drones?" Marcus smiled, the first time he'd shown confidence openly during the examination. "I believe it will exceed performance expectations, Professor." Vexthal's mandibles curved upward again, and Marcus caught something that might have been approval in her posture. "We shall see, Cadet Chen. We shall see." The countdown reached 0, and the examination period was over. Marcus stood beside his bow, watching as his classmates put finishing touches on their various creations. The testing phase would reveal whether his approach had been wisdom or foolishness, but either way, he'd stayed true to the principles his father had taught him: understand your environment, use what you have, and never underestimate the power of simple solutions to complex problems. The Academy's main testing chamber hummed with activity as Professor Vexthal led the class through its reinforced doors. Marcus had been in this facility before during basic combat training, but never as the focus of evaluation. The room was enormous, easily 100 meters long and half as wide, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows above them. Along the far wall, a series of target drones hung suspended at various heights and distances, their metallic surfaces gleaming under the bright overhead lights. "Each cadet will demonstrate their weapons capabilities in 3 phases, Vexthal announced, her forearms moving in precise gestures as she spoke. Accuracy at 50 meters, maximum effective range, and penetrating power against standard defensive materials. You will be scored on all 3 categories, with additional points awarded for innovation and practical battlefield utility." Marcus hefted his bow, testing the string tension one final time. The fluorescent tube construction had held up well during transport to the testing chamber, and the paracord wrapping showed no signs of loosening. He'd brought a dozen of his improvised arrows, each one carefully balanced, and waited for optimal flight characteristics. The other cadets arranged themselves along a firing line marked by yellow tape on the floor. Marcus found himself between Korath, whose electromagnetic device hummed ominously with stored charge, and Thrix, who was making final adjustments to her torsion spring contraption. The Elvari's pale fingers moved with mechanical precision, tightening springs and aligning projectile guides. "Cadet Pix, you may begin," Vexthal called out. The small Kytherian stepped forward with confidence, carrying what appeared to be a miniature cannon built from desk components and powered by compressed air from the classroom's pneumatic systems. She'd somehow managed to create a pressure vessel using a metal wastebasket and various sealing materials. Pix aimed at the nearest target drone and triggered her device. There was a sharp hissing sound, followed by a metallic clang as a makeshift projectile struck the drone's center mass. The impact left a visible dent, and the drone swayed on its suspension cables. Satisfactory accuracy and good penetration, Vexthal noted, making marks on her evaluation pad. Range test, please. Pix moved back to the 75-meter mark and fired again. This time her projectile fell short, clattering against the floor several meters in front of the target line. She tried once more from the same distance, adjusting her aim upward, but achieved similar results. Maximum effective range appears to be approximately 60 meters, the professor observed. Cadet Thrix, your turn. The Elvary's weapon was an elegant piece of engineering that used twisted metal springs to store torsional energy. She'd crafted her projectiles from sharpened styluses, creating dart-like objects with surprisingly good aerodynamic properties. Her first shot at 50 meters was precise, striking within centimeters of the target drone's center. Marcus watched carefully as Thrix demonstrated her weapon's range. She was clearly skilled with mechanical engineering, and her torsion system delivered projectiles with impressive velocity. However, the complexity of her design became apparent during reloading. Each shot required careful rewinding of springs and precise alignment of components. Under battlefield conditions, the rate of fire would be prohibitively slow. Excellent accuracy and good range, Vexthal commented after Thrix successfully hit targets at 80 meters. However, I note that your reloading procedure requires significant time between shots. One by one, the cadets demonstrated their creations. Zara's chemical rockets were spectacular but wildly inaccurate beyond short range. Koritha's electromagnetic launcher was powerful enough to punch through the target drones entirely, but required several minutes of manual charging between shots and seemed prone to mechanical failures. A Nexian cadet named Flux had created something resembling a giant slingshot using chair frames and elastic materials, but couldn't achieve consistent accuracy. Another student, a crystalline being whose name Marcus could never pronounce correctly, had fashioned a complex lever system that could hurl projectiles impressive distances but with no precision whatsoever. As each demonstration concluded, Marcus grew more confident in his own approach. The other weapons were impressive displays of engineering creativity, but they all suffered from the same fundamental problem: they prioritized sophistication over practicality. In trying to recreate the complexity of their species' traditional weapons, his classmates had forgotten the basic requirements of an effective battlefield tool. Cadet Chen, Vexthal called, and Marcus stepped forward. He moved to the 50-meter firing line with calm confidence, knocking one of his improvised arrows and raising the bow. The familiar weight and balance felt perfect in his hands, exactly like the hunting bow his father had made for him when he was 12 years old. He drew the string back smoothly, feeling the fluorescent tubes flex and store energy. The target drone ahead of him seemed impossibly small at 50 meters, but Marcus had been making shots like this since childhood. He accounted for the slight crosswind in the chamber, adjusted his aim point fractionally upward to compensate for arrow drop, and released. The metal rod flew in a perfect arc, striking the target drone with a solid thunk. The projectile embedded itself halfway through the drone's composite armor, leaving the rear half protruding dramatically. Excellent accuracy, Vexthal noted, but Marcus detected something else in her tone. Surprise, perhaps? Range demonstration, please. Marcus moved back to the maximum range position, nearly 100 meters from the targets. At this distance, the target drones looked like tiny specks, barely visible against the chamber's far wall. Several of his classmates had failed to reach targets at this range, and those who had succeeded showed dramatic drops in accuracy. He selected another arrow, this one slightly heavier than the first, designed specifically for long-range work. The key to extreme-range archery was understanding trajectory mathematics and energy conservation. Too light a projectile would be affected too much by air resistance, too heavy would lack sufficient initial velocity. Marcus drew the bow fully, feeling the tubes bend to their maximum safe flex point. The energy stored in the improvised weapon was substantial, probably equivalent to a 70-pound draw weight on a traditional bow. He aimed well above the target, accounting for the arrow's ballistic arc, and released. The projectile flew in a high parabola, seeming to hang in the air at the top of its trajectory before beginning its descent. Marcus watched with satisfaction as it struck the target drone near the edge, not a perfect center hit but definitely within acceptable combat parameters. A murmur ran through the gathered cadets. Several alien voices expressed what sounded like disbelief in various languages. Most impressive, Vexthal said, making more notes. Now for the penetration test. The professor activated a control panel, and one of the target drones reconfigured itself, deploying additional armor plating that doubled its apparent thickness. This was the real test. Could a primitive weapon deliver sufficient stopping power against modern defensive technologies? Marcus chose his heaviest arrow, one he'd weighted with extra metal components scavenged from the classroom. At 50 meters, he had the accuracy to place the shot precisely where he wanted it. More importantly, he understood the physics involved in penetration mechanics. The key wasn't just raw force, it was force per unit area. His sharpened projectile concentrated all the bow's energy into a very small point, creating pressure levels that could defeat even advanced armor materials. It was the same principle that made ancient arrows effective against metal armor, and it worked just as well against modern composites. Marcus drew and fired in one smooth motion. The heavy arrow struck the armored target with tremendous force, punching completely through both layers of plating and embedding itself in the drone's internal structure. Sparks flew from damaged electrical systems, and the drone's status lights flickered and went dark. The testing chamber fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems. Marcus lowered his bow and turned to face his classmates, reading amazement, confusion, and, in some cases, what might have been respect on their alien features. "Remarkable," Vexthal said finally. "Your weapon achieved superior performance in all 3 testing categories. Moreover, it appears to be the most practical design for sustained combat operations." Koritha's deep voice rumbled with what Marcus had learned to recognize as the Drakmarian equivalent of grudging admiration. The human's device requires no external power source and can be reloaded quickly. In prolonged engagement, it would outlast any of our constructions. The accuracy is also noteworthy, Thrix added, her large eyes fixed on Marcus with new interest. "I observed minimal variation between shots, suggesting the design is inherently stable rather than dependent on perfect calibration." Marcus nodded respectfully to his classmates. "Thank you. The design principles are actually quite ancient by human standards, but they've proven effective across thousands of years of warfare. Sometimes the oldest solutions are the best solutions." Zara's clicking took on an excited rhythm. "But how does it function without energy cells or plasma conduits? Where is the power source?" "The power source is the operator," Marcus explained, demonstrating by drawing the bowstring back partially. "Human muscle strength is converted to elastic potential energy in the bent limbs, then transferred to kinetic energy in the projectile. It's completely self-contained and renewable." Professor Vexthal approached Marcus's position, examining the bow more closely. Her crystalline fingers traced the paracord wrapping and tested the flexibility of the fluorescent tube construction. "This represents a fundamentally different approach to weapons design," she observed. "Rather than attempting to duplicate existing technology with inappropriate materials, you identified the core functional requirements and engineered a solution optimized for available resources." "That's exactly right, Professor," Marcus replied. "My father always taught me that good soldiers adapt to their environment rather than trying to force the environment to adapt to them." The professor's mandibles curved upward in what Marcus now recognized as genuine approval. "Your father sounds like a wise individual. This demonstration has been most educational for all of us." As the class prepared to return to the academic building, Marcus carefully unstrung his bow and gathered his remaining arrows. The improvised weapon had performed even better than he'd hoped, but, more importantly, it had proven a point about the value of understanding fundamental principles over relying on sophisticated technology. Thrix approached him as he packed up his equipment. "Cadet Chen, I must admit I underestimated the potential of your traditional approach. The engineering principles you employed are quite sophisticated, despite the apparent simplicity of the final product." "Thank you," Marcus said, genuinely pleased by the compliment. "Your torsion system was brilliant too. In fact, combining your spring technology with my bow design might create something even more effective." The Elvari's eyes brightened with interest. "A hybrid approach? That is an intriguing possibility. Perhaps we could explore such concepts during our free study periods?" As the cadets filed out of the testing chamber, Marcus caught Professor Vexthal watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was approval there, certainly, but something else as well. Calculation, perhaps, as if she were re-evaluating her assumptions about human capabilities. Marcus slung the disassembled bow over his shoulder and followed his classmates toward the exit. Today's examination had been about more than just building weapons from classroom materials. It had been about demonstrating different ways of thinking, different approaches to problem solving, and the value of understanding principles over memorizing procedures. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of what would prove to be a very interesting semester. Word of Marcus's success spread through the academy faster than he had expected. By the time he reached the dining hall for evening meal, conversation seemed to pause as he passed various tables. The attention made him uncomfortable. He'd always preferred to blend into the background rather than stand out among his more exotic classmates. The academy's cafeteria was a marvel of interspecies accommodation, with different sections designed for the varying dietary and atmospheric requirements of its diverse student body. Marcus made his way to the human-compatible zone, a relatively small area with familiar Earth-style seating and food preparation systems. Only 3 other humans attended the academy currently, all of them older cadets in different programs. Sarah Martinez, a 4th-year studying fleet logistics, waved him over to her table near the viewing ports that looked out onto the academy's training grounds. "So you're the one who's got everyone talking," Sarah said with a grin as Marcus sat down with his meal tray. "Built a bow and arrow and weapons class? Seriously?" Marcus nodded, cutting into something that approximated chicken but tasted faintly of herbs he couldn't identify. It seemed like the most practical solution given the available materials. "Practical maybe, but you've stirred up quite a controversy in the faculty lounge," Sarah continued. "Professor Vexthal has been fielding questions all afternoon about human military doctrine and whether the academy's curriculum needs to include more primitive warfare techniques." Before Marcus could respond, a shadow fell across their table. He looked up to see Commander Thale, a distinguished Zenthari officer who served as the academy's director of strategic studies. The commander's crystalline carapace bore the geometric scarification patterns that indicated high military honors, and her forearms carried the subtle positioning that Marcus had learned meant serious business among her people. "Cadet Chen," Commander Thale said, her musical voice carrying undertones of authority that made the entire dining section fall quiet. "I would like to speak with you regarding this afternoon's examination." Marcus stood immediately, recognizing the formality of the request. "Of course, Commander. How may I assist you?" "Walk with me," Thale said, turning toward the exit. Marcus followed, acutely aware that every eye in the cafeteria was tracking their movement. They walked in silence through the academy's main corridor, past displays of historical weapons and tactical innovations from dozens of civilizations. Marcus had spent many hours studying these exhibits, fascinated by the different approaches various species had taken to warfare and defense. Commander Thale led him to her office, a spacious room with curved walls that accommodated Zenthari architectural preferences. The space was dominated by a holographic display showing current galactic military deployment patterns, with thousands of colored dots representing fleet positions and potential conflict zones. "Please, sit," Thale said, gesturing to a chair designed for humanoid physiology. "I have received several interesting reports about your performance in Professor Vexthal's class." Marcus settled into the chair carefully, trying to read the commander's body language for clues about the direction this conversation might take. "I hope my work was satisfactory, Commander." Thale's mandibles curved slightly, not quite a smile, but indicating positive engagement. "More than satisfactory, Cadet. In fact, your approach has raised some fascinating questions about our standard instructional methodologies." The commander activated a control surface on her desk, and the room's holographic display shifted to show a detailed analysis of the afternoon's testing results. Marcus's bow appeared as a 3-dimensional model, rotating slowly alongside technical specifications and performance metrics. "Your weapon achieved the highest scores in all testing categories," Thale continued, "but that is not what interests me most. What interests me is the philosophical approach you demonstrated." Marcus leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite his nervousness. "Philosophical approach, Commander?" "Your classmates approached the problem from the perspective of their species' existing technological paradigms. They attempted to recreate familiar weapons using unfamiliar materials, with predictably limited success." Thale gestured toward the holographic display, where simplified models of the other cadets' creations appeared alongside Marcus's bow. "You, however, approached the problem from first principles. You identified the fundamental requirements, energy storage, projectile acceleration, accuracy, and engineered a solution optimized for those requirements rather than constrained by technological preconceptions." The analysis was exactly correct, but Marcus wasn't sure whether he was being praised or criticized. "I was taught to use whatever resources are available, Commander." My father said that good soldiers don't make excuses about equipment, they make do with what they have. Wise advice, Thale said, her head tilting in a way that indicated deep consideration. Tell me, Cadet Chen, what do you know about the current strategic situation in the Outer Rim territories? The subject change caught Marcus off guard, but he'd been following galactic affairs closely since arriving at the Academy. There's been increasing pirate activity in several systems, particularly around the trade routes between Zenthari space and the independent colonies. Standard fleet patrols have been having difficulty locating the raider bases. Correct. And why do you think conventional forces have struggled with this problem? Marcus thought carefully before answering. Military theory was still relatively new to him, but the patterns seemed clear enough. The pirates are using guerrilla tactics, avoiding direct confrontation with superior forces. They're probably based on worlds or in systems that don't appear valuable enough to warrant extensive searching. And they're likely using technology that our standard detection systems aren't optimized to identify. Commander Thale's approval was evident in her posture. An excellent analysis. The raiders are indeed using what our intelligence services describe as primitive technology, older ship designs, modified civilian equipment, weapons that don't match standard energy signatures. Our forces are equipped and trained to fight other modern military organizations, not irregular opponents using unconventional methods. The implications were starting to become clear, and Marcus felt a flutter of excitement in his chest. You're suggesting that unconventional problems require unconventional solutions. I am suggesting, Thale said, that there may be value in developing officers who can think beyond established paradigms. Your performance this afternoon demonstrated exactly the kind of creative problem solving that might prove valuable in such situations. The commander stood and walked to the viewing port that dominated one wall of her office. Beyond the transparent aluminum, the Academy's training grounds stretched into the distance, dotted with cadets engaged in various exercises. The galactic military has grown perhaps too comfortable with technological superiority, she continued. Our doctrine assumes that superior firepower and more advanced systems will always prevail. But warfare is ultimately about will, creativity, and adaptation. Technology is just a tool. Marcus joined her at the viewing port, watching a group of Drakmarian cadets practicing formation flying with personal atmospheric suits. Their movements were precise and coordinated, but also predictable, exactly the kind of tactical thinking that might struggle against irregular opponents. What would you suggest, Commander? Marcus asked. How could the Academy better prepare officers for unconventional warfare? Thale's crystalline features reflected the light from the training grounds below. That is exactly what I hoped you would ask, Cadet Chen. I am forming a special study group to examine alternative tactical approaches and non-standard equipment applications. Professor Vexthal has agreed to serve as faculty advisor, and I believe your perspective would be invaluable. The offer was unexpected and exciting, but Marcus forced himself to consider it carefully. What would this study group involve, exactly? Research into historical military innovations that don't fit current technological paradigms. Development of training scenarios that emphasize resource limitation and creative problem solving. Perhaps most importantly, challenging our existing assumptions about what constitutes effective military capability. Marcus thought about his father's stories of frontier warfare, where battles were often won by soldiers who could improvise solutions from whatever materials they could find. The galaxy's military academies focused on training officers to use sophisticated equipment effectively, but what happened when that equipment wasn't available? I would be honored to participate, Commander, he said finally. Thale's mandibles curved upward in obvious satisfaction. Excellent. The group will meet twice weekly, beginning tomorrow evening. I believe you will find your fellow participants interesting. We have recruited cadets from several different programs who have demonstrated similar unconventional thinking. As they walked back toward the main corridor, Marcus found himself thinking about the broader implications of the day's events. His simple demonstration with an improvised bow had apparently touched on much larger questions about military doctrine and strategic thinking. Commander, he said as they reached the intersection where he would turn toward the cadet quarters, may I ask why you think this kind of unconventional approach might be becoming more important? Thale paused, her forearms settling into a position Marcus recognized as indicating serious contemplation. The galaxy is changing, Cadet Chen. New threats are emerging that don't follow established patterns. Enemy forces that deliberately avoid our strengths and exploit weaknesses we didn't know we had.
Traditional military thinking assumes rational opponents who will engage us on our preferred terms.
She gestured toward the holographic star map visible through the transparent wall of a nearby classroom.
But what if our opponents refuse to play by those rules? What if they use techniques and technologies we consider obsolete or ineffective? What if they force us to fight on their terms rather than ours?
The questions resonated with Marcus's experiences growing up on frontier worlds, where survival often depended on adapting to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Then, we need officers who can think like they do, he said. Officers who can abandon conventional approaches when conventional approaches don't work.
Precisely, Thale replied.
And, today you demonstrated that such thinking is not only possible, but can be remarkably effective when properly applied. As Marcus made his way back to his quarters, he reflected on the unexpected turn his academic career was taking. He'd come to the academy hoping to prove that humans could succeed in an environment dominated by more technologically advanced species. Instead, he discovered that his supposedly primitive background might actually represent a significant strategic advantage.
The irony wasn't lost on him.
In a galaxy where most military thinking focused on maximizing technological superiority, there was apparently great value in understanding how to succeed without it. His father's lessons about resourcefulness and adaptation weren't just survival skills, they were potentially vital military capabilities that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had forgotten how to use.
Tomorrow's study group meeting promised to be very interesting indeed. 3 months after the bow demonstration, Marcus found himself aboard the Academy research vessel Synthesis, traveling through hyperspace toward the Kepler disputed zone.
The ship's mission briefing had been classified until departure, but now that they were underway, Commander Thale had gathered the special study group in the vessel's main conference room to explain their actual purpose. The situation in the Kepler system has deteriorated significantly, Thale began, her forearms manipulating the holographic display to show tactical formations and movement patterns. Pirate raids have increased by 300% over the past 6 weeks, and conventional fleet responses have been completely ineffective. Marcus studied the tactical data alongside his fellow study group members. The team had grown since that first meeting, now including 8 cadets from different species and academic programs, all selected for their demonstrated ability to think beyond established paradigms.
Thrix sat to his left, her pale Alvari features focused intently on the holographic ships.
Over the past months, she'd proven to be brilliant at mechanical engineering applications, often finding ways to improve upon Marcus's improvised designs with more sophisticated materials and construction techniques. Across the table, Zara's chitinous features reflected the blue glow of the tactical display as she analyzed the chemical composition data from recovered pirate weapons. The Nexian had developed an expertise in improvised explosives and chemical warfare that complemented Marcus's focus on mechanical systems. Standard engagement protocols have failed because the pirates refuse to engage in conventional ship-to-ship combat, Thale continued. They strike supply convoys using modified civilian vessels, then disappear into asteroid fields or planetary atmospheres where our sensors cannot track them effectively. The tactical patterns were frustratingly familiar to Marcus. His father had faced similar challenges during the frontier wars, where rebel forces had used knowledge of local terrain and unconventional tactics to neutralize the technological advantages of federal forces. The pirates are using our own tactical doctrine against us, Marcus observed. They know we expect them to behave like a conventional military force, so they're deliberately doing the opposite.
Thale's mandibles curved approvingly. Exactly correct, Cadet Chen. Which is why this mission represents the first practical application of our study group's research. We are not going to Kepler to fight the pirates using conventional methods.
She gestured, and the display shifted to show detailed schematics of the synthesis itself. Marcus was surprised to see that the research vessel had been extensively modified, with additional cargo bays and what appeared to be manufacturing facilities.
We are going to demonstrate that unconventional problems require unconventional solutions, Thale said. Your mission will be to develop and deploy countermeasures that don't rely on standard military technology or doctrine.
Pix leaned forward, her small Kytherian frame vibrating with excitement.
Are you saying we get to design and build our own weapon systems?
I am saying you get to think like pirates, Thale replied. You will have access to the same types of materials and technologies that our opponents are using. Your challenge is to develop tactical approaches that neutralize their advantages while exploiting weaknesses they don't know they have. The next several hours were spent reviewing intelligence reports and tactical analyses. The picture that emerged was of a remarkably sophisticated opponent that had studied galactic military doctrine extensively and crafted specific countermeasures for standard fleet tactics. The pirates used ships that were too small and maneuverable for capital ship weapons to target effectively, but which could carry sufficient firepower to threaten supply convoys. They employed electronic warfare systems that mimicked civilian traffic control signals, allowing them to approach targets undetected until it was too late. Most importantly, they avoided prolonged engagements entirely, preferring to strike quickly and disappear before military response forces could arrive. "They're not trying to win battles," Marcus said as the briefing concluded. "They're trying to make warfare too expensive and frustrating for us to sustain."
Classic asymmetric strategy. Professor Vexthal, who had remained silent during most of the tactical discussion, finally spoke up. "The question becomes, how do we respond to opponents who have specifically designed their capabilities to neutralize our strengths?"
"We stop playing to our strengths and start playing to theirs," Marcus replied immediately. The answer seemed obvious once the question was properly framed.
Thrix's large eyes widened with understanding. "You mean we adopt their tactics and beat them at their own game?"
"Better than that," Marcus said, ideas beginning to form in his mind.
"We take their tactics and improve on them using capabilities they don't have access to."
Over the following days, as the synthesis traveled toward the Kepler system, the study group worked with an intensity that surprised even Marcus. The ship's manufacturing facilities allowed them to prototype and test ideas that would have been impossible in a conventional academic setting. Marcus focused on developing what he termed aggressive reconnaissance systems, small, fast vehicles that could be deployed from standard cargo containers and operated remotely to track pirate movements. Using principles derived from his bow design, he created simple but effective propulsion systems that were much cheaper and more expendable than conventional military hardware.
Thrix took his basic designs and enhanced them with sophisticated guidance systems that could operate independently of external control signals.
Her engineering background allowed her to optimize efficiency and reliability while maintaining the fundamental simplicity that made the systems practical.
Zara worked on defensive countermeasures, developing chemical systems that could disable pirate vessels without requiring direct weapons engagement.
Her approach focused on area denial and equipment degradation rather than destruction, making it much easier to capture pirates for intelligence purposes. The breakthrough came when Pix suggested combining all their individual innovations into a coordinated system. Rather than developing separate solutions for different aspects of the pirate problem, they could create an integrated approach that leveraged the advantages of each technique. "The pirates are using speed and stealth to avoid conventional engagement," Pix explained during one of their evening planning sessions.
"But what if we make conventional engagement impossible for them too?"
Marcus immediately understood her thinking. "We force them into situations where their advantages become disadvantages." The plan they developed was elegantly simple in concept but required precise coordination to execute effectively. Using Marcus's reconnaissance drones, they would track pirate movements and identify their base locations. Zara's chemical systems would be deployed to deny the pirates access to their preferred hiding spots and escape routes. Thrix's guidance technology would ensure that all systems operated in perfect coordination despite the chaotic nature of three-dimensional space combat. Most importantly, the entire approach was designed to be implemented using readily available materials and technologies that pirates themselves might have access to.
If successful, the tactics could be replicated by local defense forces throughout the disputed territories.
When the synthesis finally reached the Kepler system, they found the situation even worse than the intelligence reports had indicated. 3 major supply convoys had been attacked in the past week alone, and civilian shipping had essentially stopped moving through the area. Commander Thale called the study group together for a final briefing before beginning operations. Fleet Command has authorized this mission as a proof of concept for unconventional tactical approaches.
Success here could revolutionize how we deal with asymmetric threats throughout the galaxy.
Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. 3 months ago, he'd simply been trying to pass a weapons theory examination.
Now he was part of a mission that could influence galactic military doctrine for decades to come. "Are we ready?"
Thale asked, looking around the conference table at each of the young faces.
Marcus thought about his father's lessons regarding adaptation and resourcefulness.
He thought about the bow he'd built from classroom materials and the principles that had guided its construction. Most importantly, he thought about the fundamental truth that had driven all their work: the best solutions were often the simplest ones, if you understood the problem correctly. "We're ready, Commander," he said, speaking for the entire group.
The first pirate attack came less than 6 hours later.
A supply convoy entering the system's outer shipping lane suddenly found itself under assault by 4 modified civilian vessels using sophisticated electronic warfare systems to mask their approach. But, this time, the pirates encountered something they weren't prepared for. Marcus's reconnaissance drones had detected their staging area 3 hours earlier.
Zara's chemical systems had already been deployed along their intended escape routes. Thrix's coordination algorithms ensured that every element of the defensive response activated in perfect sequence. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes.
When it was over, all 4 pirate vessels had been captured intact, their crews unharmed but completely unable to maneuver or fight effectively. More importantly, the tactical data gathered during the operation revealed the locations of 2 major pirate bases and a supply network that stretched across 4 star systems. As Marcus watched the captured pirate vessels being escorted toward the synthesis by fleet security forces, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A simple demonstration of basic engineering principles had evolved into a comprehensive rethinking of military strategy and tactics.
Professor Vexthal approached him as he stood at the observation deck watching the operation conclude. "Your father would be proud, Cadet Chen.
You have proven that wisdom and creativity are far more valuable than sophisticated technology." Marcus smiled, thinking about the improvised bow that had started everything. He always said that good soldiers use what they have. I think we just proved that great soldiers make what they need. The success in the Kepler system was only the beginning. Within 6 months, the unconventional tactics developed by the study group had been adopted by defense forces throughout the disputed territories. Pirate activity dropped dramatically as raiders found themselves unable to operate effectively against opponents who understood their methods and could counter them using equally unconventional approaches. More importantly, the Academy's curriculum was permanently modified to include courses on asymmetric warfare, resource-limited operations, and creative problem-solving. The galaxy's military academies began recruiting students not just for their technological aptitude, but for their ability to think beyond established paradigms. Marcus eventually graduated first in his class and went on to serve as a strategic advisor for fleet operations throughout the frontier regions. But he never forgot the lesson he'd learned that day in Professor Vexthal's classroom: sometimes the most advanced solution is the one that doesn't rely on advanced technology at all. Years later, when young officers asked him about the principles of unconventional warfare, Marcus would tell them about a bow made from fluorescent tubes and paracord. He'd explain that understanding fundamental principles was more valuable than memorizing procedures, and that the best soldiers were those who could succeed with nothing more than their intelligence, creativity, and determination. The bow itself eventually found a place in the Academy's Museum of Military Innovation, displayed alongside plasma rifles, quantum torpedo launchers, and other examples of advanced weapons technology. The placard beneath it read simply, "Proof that the most sophisticated solution is sometimes the simplest one."